Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight's guest, John Henry Falk. Our subject, should the House Un-American Activities Committee be abolished?
John Henry Falk is primarily known as a certified victim of an anti-communist organization called HUAC. He had been for several years a radio and television commentator and entertainer, and he sued HUAC for organizing, as his lawyer put it, a conspiracy to put him out of business. The jury encouraged, or so the defense charged by the judge, awarded Mr. Falk the most colossal judgment in libel history, $3.5 million. There wasn't that much money in HUAC's coffers, or for that matter, 1/1,000,000th that much money, and in due course, a higher court, reasoning that the jury had been carried away, reduced the judgment to a piddling $500,000. Mr. Falk then resumed his career, but has been active not only in entertaining, but in offering his own tribulation, as described in his book, Fear on Trial, as an example of what can happen to terribly innocent people when pursued by terribly prejudiced people. In recent months, Mr. Falk has arrived at the judgment that terribly prejudiced people include the members and staff of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, whose abolition, I mean the committee, not necessarily its members and staff, is urgently called for. He has publicly sponsored organizations devoted to the abolition of the committee, and presumably will be active in the biennial drive at the opening of the next Congress to persuade Congress to abolish said agency. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Falk whether he believes that the House Committee on Un-American Activities is unconstitutional.
Well, to answer your question, I've got very serious opinions to the affirmative there. Yes, it is. But let me correct you. It's not just in recent months that I've felt the House Un-American Activities Committee should be abolished, Bill. I felt it should be abolished since Mr. Martin Dyes, William Pelly Dudley, or whatever that old gentleman's name was, and the head of the Ku Klux Klan, all carrying on down there in Washington. In fact, about as long as it's been, as I've known about it, which is from its inception.
How did the Ku Klux Klan get into this? Excuse me.
Well, the head of it, let's see, I didn't have time, mate, but just a few notes.
Let's just call him the Grand Dragon.
Yeah.
How did he get into this?
Okay, the Imperial Wizard, James Colescott, says that the committees, this is a direct quote from him in his Fiery Cross of January 1942, the committee's program so closely parallels the program of the Ku Klux Klan that there's no distinguishable difference between them. I won't say that he's the one impaled, that Mr. Colescott is the one that got me started on that. But it's just that I think, Bill, really that the resolution that formed the thing, a committee, an investigative committee of the legislature, of Congress, to investigate un-American propaganda is what has always worried me. Maybe you can define un-American for me.
What, does un-American propaganda worry you?
Well, I don't know what it means. Maybe you could explain it to me, because frankly, I've always felt it was so vague. I felt kind of like the Supreme Court said in the Watkins case. It don't make much sense one way or the other.
Would you acknowledge that such a thing exists as un-American propaganda?
I say, how can I acknowledge it if I don't know what it means? See, now I know what it means to my Aunt Edith. It means anybody that went to the University of Texas, by George. They just un-American.
Well, Aunt Edith.
Wait a minute, now hold it. We got to get a commercial.
The House Un-American Activities Committee, to the United States Supreme Court, to the Ku Klux Klan. I think our audience has an idea what's in store for them this evening. We'll be back with Firing Line in just a moment.
My guess is, Mr. Falk, that I have much more sympathy for your Aunt Edith than you do. I have a feeling that you tend to patronize her. But Aunt Edith aside...
well, excuse me. Let me correct that. I don't. Well, you wouldn't patronize Aunt Edith, honey. she patronized me now. She feels that it was one of the great shortcomings of my life that I learned to read and write.
That's why I say
Upset
that
her concern.
perhaps I'm in greater sympathy with Aunt
Oh.
Edith than you are. But Aunt Edith aside,
Hey,
I mean to ask you
I
this
didn't
question.
catch
Are you prepared to distinguish between people who believe that the Chamber of Commerce can be revolutionary and pro-communist, and those others who believe that communists can be pro-communist? In other words, are you prepared to believe that, in fact, there has been a movement here in the United States during the past 40 years which has sought to subvert our foreign policy, sought to snitch our secrets, sought to contaminate idealistic liberal movements? And if so, A, what have you done about it? And B, what do you suggest the Congress of the United States do about it?
Yeah. Well, now you've rolled off a big yarn of wax there for me, old boy. I would say, see, you've asked about 8 different things, it seems to me. Do I think that they're spies trying to steal our secrets? Yes. And I think that this is rather common occurrence, you know. I don't mean that they're commonly stole. I mean that the people have spies, that they're espionage agents in this country serving a foreign country. Yes, that answers that. And I think that we have laws on the books to find them in the proper department of our government.
How'd we get those laws?
Huh?
How'd we get those laws? How'd they get
the laws
passed?
were passed.
How'd they get? Who recommended them?
Well,
I'll tell you, the House Committee on
Judiciary
American
Committee.
Activities.
Oh, go along.
Well, do you mind?
What law has it recommended?
Would you like me to name 32? I will embarrass
All
you
right.
by doing so if
Go
you
ahead.
like.
Real
Or
off
if
one
you
or two.
prefer, I will quote the Supreme Court of the United States,
All right,
which
do
in
either one
Baron
you want.
Blatt in 1959 said, quote, "The existence of such power, i.e. investigatory power, has never been questioned by this court, and it is sufficient to say without particularization that Congress has enacted or considered in this field a wide range of legislative measures, not a few of which have stemmed from recommendations of the very committee whose actions have been drawn in question, namely the House Committee on Un-American Activities."
Suggestions. Now let me give you a little
Well,
lesson
that's what I
here.
said,
Let me give you a little lesson in committees in Congress here, in case you don't understand. You know that a committee of Congress is set up to investigate in a particular field, in this instance, in the field of un-American activities, the propagation of ideas that are un-American. Now, it isn't set up because they have this standing committee, the Judiciary Committee, they're in Congress, and we're paying their salaries, keeping them up,
Come on.
to set up. I'm not
You don't
in a
care about
hurry.
salaries.
Who don't? That's my objection to the House Committee, sitting down there taking my tax money, go trotting all over the country.
That's
holding
why I've heard
services.
you speak so often about the necessity to economize in the federal government.
Well, as a
Proceed.
matter of fact,
Never mind the salaries.
go on.
Let's get down to the
Let's
functions.
get down to this legislation that they've
That's right.
suggested.
Mhm.
As a matter of fact, the Judiciary Committee considers all legislation and is charged thereby with Congress, considers all legislation that relates to and any way affects sedition, subversion, espionage in this country. Now, the House Un-American Activities Committee is not charged with, and it's not in its authorizing resolution, to search out espionage. It's charged with the investigation of un-American propaganda. And I've asked you to define for me what the mischief un-American propaganda is. I gave you one definition. I need I can give you old man Snodgrasses. He says
Don't bother.
he's kind of one-man House Committee. He's a one-man House Committee down there in Travis County.
Well,
He says un-Americanism is anything that I don't agree with.
I'm terribly
And he stays
optimistic,
with
Mr. Falk, because it seems to me that you haven't studied the legislative history of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was set up in 1934, as you may or may not know, and made a standing committee in 1946 precisely
45.
to specialize on.
It made a standing committee in 45.
It was discussed in 45 and made part of the Congressional Reorganization Act of
By
1946.
the way, you want to tell them who made it
And
that?
precisely-
Who was the congressman?
Now,
that
this
saw it
is
through?
irrelevant. It was
No, it
made
isn't. I think
precisely
it's terribly
because,
important for my attitude
well,
concerning
it's
it.
important if your other point wasn't important, which I was
Congressman
seeking to answer.
Congressman Rankin
So
of Mississippi.
what?
Oh, no. Now wait a minute. I'm not even going to ask you to justify Congressman Rankin.
If you were
One of
suggesting,
the most notorious anti-Semites that ever sat in the Congress of the United States.
if you were
He
suggesting,
made this thing to order. Who sounded off against it when it was set up as a standing committee? After Martin dies, had occasioned President Roosevelt to say it was one of the, and I want to get the quote direct, so I'm going to take it right here if you'll forgive me. President Roosevelt said it was assortedly, flagrantly unfair and un-American. That's his use of the term. I don't use the term un-American because I can't define it explicitly enough. And I hope to learn here. After he'd said that, old Martin dies. It was dying on the vine as a special committee. And old Rankin, realizing it's the perfect vehicle for him to smear and slander and go up and down the land using this very technique that it has used and become notorious for throughout the land to destroy the careers, Bill. I know good and well that you wouldn't concur with that, Southern. Destroy the careers, smash the lives of school teachers, of performers, of people in all areas of lives, all areas of life in America. You wouldn't justify that. It's been reckless and careless and shoddy in its habits. It goes marching into a town with its coterie behind it, announcing ahead of time we're going to subpoena Miss Jones, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Brown in great red probe. And all of the vigilante groups in town see that the school teachers and the school boards all know this very well, see, and these poor devils never have a chance. And you know it, Bill. A lot of times they don't even call them. They just smear the names across the headlines and the people's lives are destroyed. This is unjustifiable. Look what they did to me. Do you know the case, what they did to me? Most scandalous thing in the world. Operates as a vigilante committee, Bill.
as I understand it, we had to oppose the Bill of Rights because 80% of the people who passed it were slave owners. That is to say, a piece of legislation or a constitution or any charter is to be measured on the basis of the personal standards of the people who passed it. Now,
well, wait a minute. That wasn't my point. You can't feed that moldy corn and catch it.
I don't think it's very easy to capture your point, but I will make my conscientious effort to do so.
Bill, now you know good and well a Bill of Rights is the very foundation of this country's freedom.
That's right.
Well, do you think
the Bill of
resolution forming the House Un-American Activities Committee has anything to do with freedom, of thought, or expression, or the suppression of that?
In this respect, I'm an outrageous radical who sides with 98% of the Congress of the United States and with all of the members of the Supreme Court, who respectively have renewed the mandate of the Congress of the United States.
Every year.
It's very easy, incidentally, may I tell you something? One of the reasons why anti-communists despise arguments like yours is because they're so palpably demagogic. You imply that the House Committee on Un-American Activities exists because Rankin invented it, but you never bother to tell your audiences because you assume they're as dumb as Aunt Edith, that the House's charter was renewed every 2 years, years after Rankin died.
Yes, I know. Yes,
and I have no doubt.
I thought they knew it. I thought we were talking about abolishing.
And I have no doubt that you can sneak out of the consequences of your own demagogy. But the Supreme Court of the United States and the Congress of the United States.
Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse me for cutting in here. What we like, of course, is a nice conversation between people.
At the same time,
we'll continue with the firing line tonight in just a moment.
But I want to hear what he has.
I was about to say, Mr. Falk, that one of the reasons why some people don't take you as seriously as I think you would like to be taken is because they have a feeling that you don't really look into the arguments with integrity. I mean, for instance, I've never heard you refer to the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States, a court that is dominated by a general understanding by liberals, certified the constitutionality, for instance, of the internal security law by a specific reference to the findings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or, as I mentioned in the Baron-Blatt decision of the same Supreme Court, gave specific credit to the House Committee on Un-American Activities for performing very important legislative goal, namely informing the Congress sufficient to permit a reasonable distinction between the Communist Party, for instance, and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, if you want to talk about the excesses of that committee, I think this would be interesting. We could talk about the excesses of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party.
Say anything about the
No, that's
Democrats.
what I say.
I can talk about the Republican
That's right.
Party.
I'm afraid that it's rather difficult to cause you to reason on this subject.
We got a Texan in the White House. You better step
It may be that you're rather febrile on the subject and therefore unequipped to talk about the subject about which you're so sensitive.
In the first place, let me say something, and I mean this in all sincerity. I didn't intend to be demagogic. I was making perhaps, kind of
Strike the
halfway
Democrat
attempts to
thing.
be. No, I was trying to be clever on a very serious subject, really. And you've asked about this legislation that they have suggested, and that merits, I think, a close examination, because that is a very serious matter. If they're performing a service down there that they were authorized to perform by the governing body, the Congress there, if that committee is, then it has a positive purpose, don't it? And is doing service to the community and serving a real purpose. You see, my fault is with the fact that the legislature down there, the Congress down there, works for me. I don't work for them. They serve me. I don't serve them. I'm not answerable to any congressman in this land for any of my opinions or any of my associations. Nor are you, Mr. Buckley. And I would raise the mischief if they hauled you down there and said, "What are you doing putting out this paper here?"
And I might or might not be grateful. My point is that the Congress of the United States is charged by the Constitution with providing for the common security. And my guess is that there's not going to be much common security unless we protect ourselves, again, to quote from the Constitution, from enemies, foreign and domestic.
There you're talking.
Now, the point is that there are some domestic enemies, and it is the function of a progressive Congress to design laws that are suited to checkmate those enemies who develop new stratagems, new techniques, new insights by which they fool, if I may say so, people like you.
Now, for instance, I think you fool,
I'd like to ask you.
Let me address myself to that remark first.
Yes, and let me pursue that.
I think it's an important one.
For instance,
you're absolutely sound. Congress is charged by that.
Correct.
But you know, when the old boys got back there and they founded this Constitution, you know, the public, the people of the country were very suspicious of power. They'd had it with old King George, and they said, "Look here, we don't want no government looking down our necks. We're scared of government." So Congress, and old man John Jay and Alexander Hamilton writing the Federalist Papers, urged them, saying, "Listen, we're going to put in 10 amendments there that protects the people from an oppressive government." And the first amendment they put in there was, "Congress shall pass no law restricting a man's right to say what he pleases, think what he pleases."
You realize that by one interpretation of that law, you couldn't have gone and won $3.5 million. But go ahead.
Oh, now, wait a minute. Now, you hold on. Hold on.
You don't believe in complete free speech, do you? No, but now let me tell you something.
No, you raise this issue and then don't let me answer it.
Now, wait a minute.
You know that my charges were, you just said, a conspiracy to libel me. I don't care what a Ware says about me. Honey, a Ware they've got a perfect right to say that I believe the moon's made out of green cheese as they want to. I never quarreled with a Ware's right to do that.
Yeah.
What I quarreled with was a Ware's right to form a conspiracy to force me out of business, to blacklist me, to make me unemployable, which they did to many, many people who got up and testified in open court to it.
Why didn't you sue the people who refused to hire you rather than the people who urged them using their free speech to try to persuade them not to?
Let me read you what the court said. No. But I guess you're going to let me read this because you done raised this.
Just a moment, but may I, Mr. Falk?
Let me just read one little thing you said about it. Now, this is the appellate division said this. And they've reviewed the entire case now, and they've reviewed all the testimony of the defendants, that was Ware, and of the plaintiff, me, all of the evidence and everything. And they said, so we have, as found by the jury, amply supported by the evidence, a vicious libel, desperately and maliciously planned and executed with devastating effect upon the plaintiff, all without a semblance of justification. The guilt of the defendants was so clearly established by the other evidence in the case as to have left the jury no choice but to find the defendants liable.
We're not talking about whether or not Ware was guilty or not. We're
Well,
talking
you
about.
said I didn't believe in their freedom of speech.
No,
There was no exercise of
we're
freedom of
talking
speech. This
about
was a
the
conspiracy.
fanatical extension of it. I happen to believe, unlike, for instance, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, I happen to believe in laws of libel. I happen also to believe that there are certain implicit limits in freedom of speech that are postulated by a free society, even an open society. But what I am very much interested in is that you should proceed in such apparent ignorance of the role of the Communist Party in this country as to desire to exterminate a committee of Congress simply because by some parliamentary accident it was introduced into legislation by a man you disapprove of. Would you take a different position about the House Committee on Un-American Activities if it was introduced if it had been introduced by Emanuel Sella? And yet, may I remind you that
let me explain to you. It's been only criticized by Emanuel Sella, never praised.
But
He
Emanuel
wouldn't found
Sella,
such a committee. In fact, he urged Congress not to do it.
Are
So did
you-
Speaker of the House McCormick.
are you
He said,
aware
"Don't do
that
this,
Emanuel
we're gonna use
Sella has voted for its appropriation?
I'm aware, honey. I go to those congressmen. It's a
well,
sight.
thank heavens.
It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing, Bill, because you go down there and they say, we loathe and despise this committee. But, Johnny, I've got so much legislation on my back. If I so much as raised a finger, every hate group in my district would jump me. They would fill this office full of protests. They would say that I'm trying, as you are, that this committee is rescuing us from a fate worse than death with a terrible Congress. Bill, they've been down there for almost 30 years, 28 years. They've been drawing the taxpayers' money to investigate what?
In 28 years, they
The
haven't made
opinions and the behavior
in
of
20
people.
years, they haven't made as much money as in your inflated estimate of your own abilities you demanded from Aware.
Aha, now you have, wait a minute, that's a good point, except you left something out. I didn't demand it of Aware. This is the thing, folks, let me tell y'all what happened.
No,
After they
folks.
sat and listened, now, you are going to listen. This is not going to be fun. but you
Folks are
listen.
not, listen, my famous folks are not here to listen to a history.
No, but you're going
of
to
your
listen to this
tribulation.
point. You're gonna
Why
listen
don't
to this
you
point,
just hold
it's
up your
terribly
book,
important. You
and I
made
will
it.
sit still. You
would
urge them
charge
all
me
to
with
read.
Gentlemen, you know what you both are saying is so very interesting and very amusing, and we want to hear both of you and what you have to say, but we can't hear it this way.
All right, but just let me
Mr.
make
Buckley.
one point. I did not demand $3.5 million of the jury. Mr. Buckley has just said I did. I'm for Aware. What I did was sit there, and the jury listened for 3 months to the evidence and the defenses of Aware and the charges of ours, the evidence that we presented, and then they came running back in. We asked $2 million. They said, "Please let us give $3.5 million," which is a little different, you know.
Yes, of course.
And incidentally, Bill, I agree with you. That was, you described it as an opera bouffe decision in your magazine and an editorial in it. I thought it was the best description I heard of it for this reason, that it just messed my case up no end, because you see, so many people saw that they didn't know. All of my Ku Klux Klan kinfolks down in Texas were going around saying, George, that's wonderful. You know, I'm going to quit calling people communists and start getting called that. It pays better. and it was the silliest thing in the world, and nobody knew what the issues were.
Yes, that's right. I
Until
agree.
just a moment ago, you.
But
Well,
now-
the issue tonight is the House Un-American Activities
Yes,
Committee.
and I'm sorry. Well, all right, now I won't interrupt you again, Bill. You go.
Well, a while ago, we were talking about whether or not the House Committee on Un-American Activities had actually contributed to the legislation of the land. Now, may I remind you of two things? Namely, that with the exception of 4 years, the legislators in Congress have been Democrats, ranging from a 68% majority to a 54% majority. Now, here is a scholar who records that in the years 1941 to 1960, the House Un-American Activities Committee made 129 legislative recommendations to Congress.
That's right.
Of these, 33 were repetitious of recommendations HUAC itself had made. 96 were separate, distinct, and new. 35 of these recommendations were passed by both the House and the Senate. They are today a part of the law of the land. Now,
those figures are just fooling daylights out of folks. Look,
Now,
any
those are
congressman down there can get up and say, I think we ought to pass a law to move the entire capital to Texas instead of just the White House. And he can make it, he can recommend it, but it doesn't pass, does it? Now, what has happened is the House Un-American Activities Committee, in this instance, Verdi, for instance, they go around beating their breast about passing that 1954 and that set up the
The
communist.
Humphrey bill?
Oh, quit saddling me with the vice president now. You and Lyndon can have him. I won't
You
talk
realize
about
he led his
something else.
passage through the Senate, don't you?
Wait, through the Senate.
Yes.
I thought it was the House Un-American Activities Committee bill. Now you tell me it's a Senate
You
bill.
recognize there are two branches of the legislature, don't you? And you can't pass a law without
I knew
getting
that, and that's the reason I
vote.
wondered why you were giving the House Un-American
And
Activities
Hubert
Committee
Humphrey
credit for
back
that.
in the Senate and was its leader of the particular bill you're talking about. But proceed.
The point is this, that O'Veldy, he was running the show down there. Now, I don't know whether he's on top, they pass along there, but at any rate, he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he'd introduced a bill. Huh? No, I think he's a Republican.
Mhm.
She don't like them. She suspects them. She lumps them in, with the communists. She really does. Terrible thing.
We're going to continue with tonight's edition of Firing Line with our guest, John Henry Falk, our host, William F. Buckley Jr., in just a moment.
Mr. Falk, for instance, one of the tasks of the House Committee on Un-American Activities is to try to do the research necessary to warn idealistic liberals about organizations which are dominated by the Communist Party. That is to say, that there are a number of liberals whose motives cannot be questioned, who seek this or that social reform, this or that change in foreign policy, and would like to be able to seek and to press for that change without being manipulated by communists. Now, I take it that you agree that there is such a thing as a communist front. And the question is whether or not it is a useful function for a legislative committee of the Congress of the United States exercising its subpoena power and exercising its right to compel testimony, to conduct hearings seeking to, for instance, distinguish between the American Civil Liberties Union, which is not communist dominated, and the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which in the committee's judgment is. Now, for instance, you have recently joined at a bash sponsored by the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee.
Yeah.
And the question is, oughtn't you to feel a little bit ashamed of yourself at being manipulated by people who, according to the best evidence, are not in the least interested in civil liberties, but are interested in using John Henry Falk as sort of a doll, which they can deploy for their own sinister purposes?
As a doll, thank you. Tell you, see, you started off this whole bit there with a description of what the House Un-American Activities Committee was founded for, which gives the whole key to my objection to it away. You said it's set up to enable liberals to expose for exposure's sake is literally what you're saying. And there's no such authority granted that committee, and you know it as well as I do.
Utter nonsense.
Well, of course there's not.
I will give you
It's supposed
5
to,
Supreme
no
Court
congressional
decisions
committee. There's nowhere in
permitting
the
it, if you like.
Constitution of the United States you can justify a legislative branch of this government, and that's indeed what the committee is, a part of the legislature of this government, going around poking into people's opinions. It's
Have you never heard of the
expressly forbidden to.
Have you never heard
Now,
of
you
the
stand up
informing? Wait a minute. Don't ask me so many rhetorical questions. Let me answer them. Have you ever heard of the informing function of Congress? Have you ever read the basic textbook of Woodrow Wilson?
I've read the Constitution of the United States and know that the
Yeah,
First
but
Amendment
obviously you
says Congress
misunderstood
shall
it.
pass no law
That's right. And who's talking about
regarding
passing
a
the law?
man's right to hold an opinion.
Mr. Falk,
And the
I
House
beg you to
Un-American
focus
Activities
your
Committee.
attention on the point at issue.
But you go
Stop
circling
talking
around
about
like.
passing laws. I'm talking about whether or not Congress has an informing function.
All right.
And one of the informing functions is presumably to save you from the humiliation which I would hope you would feel by making an ass of yourself from time to time as manipulated by the Communist Party.
Well, but this is a very interesting description you give my behavior, that I would be humiliated and feel like an ass for exercising
And
my
you
rights
on
as
one
a free
side.
American citizen.
You
This
mean to say
reflects
that you
a very
can't...
interesting point of view on your part
Do you
and the
mean to
committee's
say...
report,
Do you mean
Bill,
to say...
that you go around, you
can't
press
recognize
something I
it?
don't like and you're an ass and
Yes.
humiliating?
Is George
Well,
Lincoln
feel it.
Rockwell an ass?
Who gave
He's
you or
exercising
Congress
his
the
rights.
authority to decide whether the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee is communist?
Precisely the Bill of
Seventh-day
Rights.
Adventist.
Precisely the Bill of Rights.
Not
A moment ago,
Well, cite it.
You
Cite
said
your
you...
answer.
A moment
Cite where
ago,
it
you
is.
said you respected
Cite your authority. Don't slip
Why,
off the hook like that.
Don't keep talking
All right,
while you ask
right.
me to talk. Either
That's
talk
right.
or
I
ask me to talk.
I apologize.
Okay.
Go ahead. Let
A
go.
moment ago, you cited precisely my right under the Bill of Rights to pass judgment. I am passing a judgment concerning the manipulation of communist-dominated front groups, of good-minded liberals, and saying those people are permitting themselves to be made asses of, in which category, with all due respect, I include you, in virtue of your recent
Well, I can't think
associations with,
anything
for
more
instance,
flattering
that.
than have that.
Now, for you to say that you don't make an ass of yourself simply because you have the right to freedom of speech
No.
doesn't say anything at all.
That's
George
what
Lincoln
I said.
Rockwell is an
You-
ass, so he's
that is-
availing himself of
Yes,
the Bill
and
of
one
Rights.
of the greatest champions of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Every time they
No,
start
on the
talking about
contrary,
appropriation, he
he-
goes walking around.
He thinks it's a Jewish plot. Aren't you aware? My God, you're behind
You know
on
who's this champion, boy. You know it, old George Lincoln Rockwell and every other hate group in this country. The House Un-American Activities Committee now, Bill, lays up there like an old South, you'll forgive the indelicate description, an old South suckling all these hate pigs like old George Lincoln Rockwell and all of these little saved south end of Bastrop County, Texas.
What do you mean
from,
suckling? I don't get
communism.
the analogy.
Feeding them this trash
them
that
what?
they gather in these
What kind of
names
trash?
that
Give me
they
an
go in
example.
and- Oh, Lord, have
No,
mercy.
just one. Just one. After the Lord has had mercy, be kind enough to give me an example.
Lord have mercy on me. I think he's had it
It's
now.
a good point.
Good. Bill, here is what happens at a hearing. You know that a Harvey Matuso or whoever that man is, that's old Schwartz, that's head of the anti-communist, Christian
matter with
anti-communist
What's the
crusade.
matter with Schwartz?
I don't know. I've been trying to figure
Well,
out.
why do you bring
whether
up his
it's a-
name? Why do you bring up his name?
Because I have no respect for the man at all. But
If
just
you,
like
if
you
you
don't
were as
have
litigious
for
as
the-
you, he would sue you for $3.5 million of libel.
I said I don't have any respect for him.
Yeah.
I'm bound to have respect for him. That isn't what Blair said
But-
about me, honey.
It's
But let me tell you,
yeah.
although
That's
I
right.
don't think you do. Bill, the point that I'm trying to make is every single witness, and they called thousands of them. And this, I think the American public should know, because many of them don't realize
Go
it.
ahead, Tom.
Get up before the House Un-American Activities Committee. They're granted congressional immunity as a witness. They can spill all the names they want, and you know they have these hired informers that go around, old Paul Crouch, Harvey Matuso, all these names then. They say, yes, we think they're coming. Yeah, we think they're coming. Yeah, they said, ooh, that was a bad one there. Well, they wasn't exactly communistic, but he did say he didn't go to church regular. And all this stuff, they stack it up in the files of the House Un-American Activities Committee and all these hate groups around over the country. It happened. Look what happened to old man
Miss Fox,
Snodgrass.
that's the kind of a description of the House Committee on American Activities that I would expect to read in the Daily Worker. Are you aware? Do you have any respect for the New York Bar Association by any chance?
A great deal. Yes.
Well, the New York Bar Association recommended a code of behavior for the House Committee on Un-American Activities, 1953, which was 100% adopted. Are you aware of that?
I know this
Now,
about
under
the
the
House
cir-
Un-American
un- un-
Activities Committee. Let me
yeah,
tell you what they did,
yeah.
Bill.
I
think
have
this
written a
is terribly
book on the
important.
subject, and I hate to
All right.
embarrass you, but
know it,
all of
and-
this
and-
business
and-
about
and agree
he's
with
a
that.
communist because he didn't go to church,
and
and
I-
Aunt Edith would disagree with him.
All right, let me
It's
tell you
hardly
what
the
they
level at which to carry
Let's
this
get down
argument
to- Let's
forward.
get down to variance in case. You know I was involved in this big lawsuit. Now, we discovered that the House Un-American Activities Committee and certain members of the defendants, the WARE, was functioning with the House Committee, exchanging information with them.
What's the matter with that?
We subpoenaed our first. Nothing's the matter with it. They can it suggests the quality of sources that the House Un-American Activity Committee uses. At any rate, we called our first witness pretrial examination, and Mr. Hartnett. Within a week, I had received a subpoena from the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was very fascinating.
I don't get
because
the
with
point. Excuse me.
you don't.
No, sir.
Well, let me suggest the point to you then.
Don't suggest.
Because
Tell me.
within 2 weeks, the House Un-American Activities Committee announced it's coming to New York, and they were going to hail me up before them, see. But they were also going to be the guests of honor at a cocktail party for the defendants, Aware Incorporated, who sent out their invitation, charged you $1.75 to come honor the House Un-American Activities Committee. Well,
Well,
Mr. Nizer quite properly took the position, said, "Now looky here, that won't do. You can't. The defendants can't use their wing down in Washington. This is supposedly a duly constituted Committee of Congress, supposed to be about serious work up here doing Aware's business, and so they didn't call me. Let me tell you,
isn't it a
they
question?
continued my commitment. Let me tell you about
No, sir.
continuing my.
Just 1 second. Isn't it a matter whose cocktail party you go to? You specialize, as far as I can see, in going to cocktail parties in honor of hostile witnesses.
Come on now, don't.
You, in 1963, you went to a cocktail party sponsored by the Emergency Liberties
Civil
Committee.
Liberties Union,
Civil
a very
Liberties- no,
fine
committee,
group of civil
committee.
libertarians that are after the House committee
Yeah,
nipping tuck.
that's
Thank
right.
heavens, and I hope they get them.
And who all was there?
They've
A couple
exposed more
of people
deviltry
who,
of that committee than anybody else.
a couple of people who have been identified as members of the
Right.
Communist Party,
Here we
and
go.
one of whom served a jail sentence because the Supreme Court was convinced that indeed he was guilty of contempt of Congress. Now, apparently,
wait,
it's
see this.
apparently
Wait, now
it's
let's examine
it's
what you
perfectly
just
all
said.
right for you to go to cocktail
Oh.
parties to celebrate people
Oh,
who
now,
refuse
come
to
on,
cooperate
come
with the
on.
government.
You know you can't
Now, wait a
run on
minute.
like that.
But it's not all right for people to go to cocktail parties who support their own duly elected legislators.
You know, there's an old boy named Boots Cooper that was advertised as the greatest violinist in Manchac, Texas. And you go down there and he'd play his violin and play Turkey and Straw and just make everybody cry or dance one. And everybody said, isn't he the world's greatest? The only thing is, that's the only tune he could play. And so it just ain't the world's greatest violinist. And I don't think you're the world's greatest authority on the groups of people with whom you choose to differ. And this is the
certainly not.
very evil that the House Un-American Activities
A lot of
Committee
people are much
perpetrates
more about
on this society of ours,
I will
Bill.
bow to the judgment of
It
the
goes
staff of the
around
House
using
Committee,
just
for
the
instance.
language
They know
that
much
you
more than I
use.
do about it.
A
Mr.
man
Falk.
that took the Fifth Amendment. Are you going to condemn somebody for exercising constitutional rights?
Mr. Falk,
depends.
excuse me for just a moment.
did it.
We have another group of people here, then they have some questions they'd like to address you and to Mr. Buckley. We'll be back with questions from our studio audience in just a moment. It is time for questions now from our studio audience. The first question comes from Mr. Frederick Weber, who is a stockbroker. Mr. Weber, would you stand up, please?
Yes. The question is addressed to either member of the panel. What provision of the Constitution gives the Congress the power to pass judgment on the opinions or associations of citizens?
None.
In that case, what is the constitutional power resting in any investigating committee to ask questions concerning either opinions or associations of citizens?
Well, to quote the Supreme Court, it is the right of any society to defend itself. That is an exact quotation. So long as a society has the right to defend itself, it has the right to take apposite means according to its own best lights to defend itself. In the last analysis, said the Supreme Court, this power, i.e. the power to investigate subversive activity, quotes, rests on the right of self-preservation. Signed, Earl Warren.
Mr. Falk?
I would answer that there is no constitutional power granted to the Congress, and consequently, the House Un-American Activities Committee is an unconstitutional committee. The day will come, and I hope very shortly, that the Supreme Court of the United States will concur in this. They keep shearing it off, by the way, Bill. They keep knocking them down and saying it's got the flimsiest excuse for existence they can think of. And I can too.
Sir, in 30 years of history, the House Committee on Un-American Activities has been criticized by the Supreme Court twice, most recently in 1959, very tangentially, and not at all since 1959.
What did the Watkins case hold, Bill?
That's the decision I was referring to. And anyway, that wasn't the House Committee on American, that was the Internal Security Subcommittee.
That was the
So it wasn't
56.
there, yeah.
Let's try now.
That was a different committee, Mr.
Well, we're
Falk.
getting
Different
off
committee,
the
yeah.
Let's try now to turn to
We want to
Harry
abolish that,
Foreman.
of course, too, don't we? Yeah.
My question is for Mr. Buckley. I didn't hear you answer Mr. Falk's question as to what is un-American propaganda. Would you tell us what that is in your opinion?
I think it is very, very difficult to decide, except relatively. For instance, if the United States were to become communist, then presumably it would be un-American to be anti-communist. So I grant that this is a relativist definition, which is one of the reasons why in my book on the subject I came out against the title Un-American Affairs Committee. I came out in favor of its changing its title to the Anti communist investigating committee.
You did, however, refer to un-American propaganda, so I
I
wondered
referred
what
to
you
the
meant.
title of the committee, which I did not invent.
Yes. But the thing is, now this is the reason I say it's unconstitutional, because he can't define it, the Supreme Court can't define it, the House Un-American Activities Committee can't define it, yet the sole authority that they operate under, it uses the wording, a committee to investigate un-American propaganda.
Well, it's not all that difficult, Mr. Falk, because
Well, you just said I don't believe there's
so I say that
description of
it does meet my own highest standards, but presumably that is un-American, which, for instance, advocates the overthrow of the Constitution of the United States by force or violence.
Well, was Thomas Jefferson un-American? He said a little revolution now and then is good for a country.
Before we get a revolution in this country, I'd like to call upon Tilly Hillner to ask her question.
Yes, my question is addressed to Mr. Falk. But before I address my question to Mr. Falk, it's not relevant to the discussion, but I'd like to make a preface to Mr. Buckley. Mr. Buckley, you've converted me. With this, I used to be a liberal Democrat, but listening to you and following your discussions, I've become a Buckley conservative. As I said, my question is not relevant to the discussion, but this has been bothering me a lot. Maybe this had something to do with my becoming a Buckley conservative. Can a democracy exist in a welfare state, which I think today we have?
Lordy, honey, I've heard it argued so back and forth. First of all, I want to thank you, Miss Tillery, for saying that Mr. Buckley had converted you and that I had not deconverted you. That's what I thought you were going to say. As a matter of fact, I think whatever a welfare state is, and there we get off into definitions again. I'm not sure what you mean by welfare state. I think whatever laws there are on the books of this land, whatever provisions the Constitution allows the legislature to pass for the welfare of the people, and that's the sole function of the government. You know, we are sovereign in this country. The people are sovereign. The legislature is our servant. They are to function in our behalf. Now, when the legislature passes laws providing old age pensions, I presume that was one of your welfare measures, or help to blind children, which is a welfare measure, or handicapped children, that sort of thing. I see no conflict with that in democracy. Any law that's democratically, or any Congress that's democratically elected, and it is, thank heavens, that's the sacred thing about this country, the people's right to pass on what becomes law in the land. Who does the law passing? The lawmakers every 2 years come to us and say, well, here's what I stand for, and another says, well, I stand for something else. So we select, and this is a terribly and sacred thing as far as I'm concerned, for free men, because we're people that govern ourselves. Now, when our servants in the legislature pass laws that, and they have been democratically elected, I see no conflict between those laws and democracy at all, but to the contrary, aid and support for them. They pass laws that I oppose. They pass laws that are unconstitutional. But the judiciary branch of the government passes on that, and they say, I'm sorry, this law is in conflict with the Constitution and can't stay on the books. So I wouldn't see any necessary conflict there. Maybe Mr. Buckley can enlighten me some.
I think we'd better go back to Mr. Scott.
And Mr. Scott is going to call on Peter S. Alsop, a banker, for a question.
I would address my question to Mr. Buckley. Mr. Falk has mentioned excessive and vigilante-type activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and I would wonder if you would comment on whether these accusations by him or by anyone else have at any time been justified.
Well, he has suggested, Mr. Falk has suggested, that the committee has acted excessively from time to time. He has not enumerated those excesses, at least not to such an extent as to make it possible for you or me to agree or disagree with him as to whether or not they were excessive. I have absolutely no doubt in point of fact. I think it is correct that it has acted excessively. I don't know of any committee in Congress that has not acted excessively. Certainly, I believe that the President of the United States and the Supreme Court have acted excessively from time to time, which does mean that I'm going to be in favor of abolishing the presidency or abolishing the Supreme Court. The House Committee on Un-American Activities is composed of human beings, and those human beings do a good or a bad job depending on what you and I happen to think of their performance over a given moment. As regards, however, the gravamen of Mr. Falk's charge, which is that they are operating counter to the heart and soul of the Constitution of the United States, all I can say is that nobody, no responsible legal scholar has so maintained, and the Supreme Court of the United States has not so maintained.
Bill, you don't keep up with the left-wing material in the New York Times. There's a full-page ad about 2 months ago signed by some of the most distinguished legal scholars in this country demanding its abolition, that it had no function at all and was running contrary to the Constitution. But if I might just comment, because Bill is quite right, I didn't enumerate my charges. Over here in Newark, and here, as I say, I didn't have the proper time to, and I should apologize to the radio, television audience as well as Mr. Buckley for this, and you. I didn't have proper time to prepare for this, and I should have. But they have gone into college towns. They have gone over here in Newark. They got after some school teachers. Headlines, teachers called in red probe, destroying these teachers. They've done this all over the country. This isn't something new. They've destroyed college professors. Colleges have passed regulations that a teacher couldn't teach that. It took the Fifth Amendment, which is part of the Constitution, to save himself from harassment by the House Un-American Activities Committee. There have been a number of suicides from people that were harassed. There was a young man out in California not long ago that was literally, it was in the mid-50s, 55. His name doesn't come to mind now. You might know it, Bill, who had a wife and 4 children and was called before a one of those public kangaroo courts that the House Un-American Activities Committee comes off with their savage questioning. You understand that a person called can't bring witnesses. He can't cross-examine. He can only be pinned down and nailed and humiliated. And if he wants to defend his friends, and not name a lot of people that were in some club that they want to know about 25 years before, he has to take the Fifth Amendment or be held in contempt.
You are watching Firing Line with William F. Buckley Jr. and tonight's guest, John Henry Falk. We'll return in just a moment.
Mr. Falk, if the House Committee on Un-American Activities were what you say it is, and tolerated as it is by 95% of the legislators in this country and by the Supreme Court, then I would say that the American experiment in democracy has definitely failed. I prefer to think that the latter is not justified on the basis of the performance of the former. Thank you so much for coming on this program.
Thank you for being a very gracious host, Bill.